Thank you so much to everyone at Teaching House for inviting me along, and thank you to all of you for joining me. I don't know what time it is where you are, but it's sort of 8 o'clock in the evening here nearly, and it's been a long day of kind of teaching and writing and going to the dentist. So, not on top form, but let's see how we get on. So I'm going to begin this session with a strange kind of confession, okay, which may seem like an odd thing to do, but there is a reason for me doing this. And the confession is that I don't speak the same language as you. You might be listening to that thinking, what kind of madness is this to begin with? If you're expecting us to listen to you for the next 40 minutes, surely we need to have a language in common. And you could argue that, we all have English as a lingua franca. This is what allows us to sort of communicate together at events like this, yeah? Well, yes and no, I think, in lots of different ways. Because, of course, we all do share a common language. It's why you're still able to continue listening to me at this stage. But I think the way in which we use language is much more idiosyncratic and much more individual than maybe you've realized. And if you don't believe me, maybe you'll believe forensic linguists instead. For those of you that don't know anything about forensic linguistics, it's basically a branch of applied linguistics that applies sort of linguistic knowledge and methods and procedures and insights to the forensic contexts of law. Forensic linguists are basically kind of analysing evidence based on language in the hope that this will solve legal problems. And I'm going to begin just with a couple of examples to show you what I mean by this. Some of you may recognise this guy. This guy is called Ted Kaczynski, and he was a former maths professor and American domestic professor who ended up living completely off-grid, way up in the mountains, and he became better known as the Unabomber. Between 1978 and 1995, he had this kind of relentless bombing campaign that he carried out, where he killed 3 people and injured 23 others in this nationwide, it was like mail bombs that he was sending against people that he believed were advancing modern technology at the expense of the environment. So many people to choose from, I'd imagine, if those are your targets that you're going for. In 1995, after what was at that point the longest ever FBI investigation and the most expensive FBI investigation, Ted Kaczynski slipped up because he sent a handwritten letter to the New York Times promising that he would stop his terror campaign if they published his manifesto. The essay was eventually published in the Washington Post that autumn. And afterwards, Kaczynski's estranged brother, called David, recognized the prose style of his brother and reported these suspicions to the FBI. Forensic linguists were then allowed to compare the manifesto that he'd sent to the New York Times with earlier essays and rantings and letters that he'd sent to his brother. And they concluded that there was a 98% probability that they were written by the same person, and an arrest was made soon afterwards, and he ended up being sentenced to life in prison. You might be thinking that just being able to recognize your reclusive brother from the themes and tropes and ideas and obsessions that are apparent in his discourse might not seem that remarkable. But the evidence that led to the next arrest I'm going to talk about is maybe a little bit more remarkable. The guy in the fetching orange jumpsuit here was a guy called Chris Coleman. And in the early 2000s, he was a security chief advisor for a famous American TV evangelist. Has all the trappings of a kind of great Netflix series, just this introduction. And he basically started around the beginning of 2009, telling friends of his that he was worried for his family's safety because he'd started receiving death threats from an obsessive online stalker. He had a neighbour over the road from where he lived in New York who was a police officer and a friend of his. And he got his neighbour to train a security camera on the front of his house. More and more threatening messages started arriving. And on May the 5th, 2009, something awful happened. He got up early and went off to the gym. And on his way to work, he tried to phone his wife, but couldn't reach her. So he phoned his police officer friend over the road, who had a spare set of keys. And this guy went into the house. And on entering the house, he found Chris Coleman's wife and kids murdered. They'd both been strangled. And there was blood red graffiti all over the house, sprayed, saying things like, excuse my French, fuck you and you have paid. A back window had been opened into the apartment, which kind of suggested that the murderer knew about the camera out the front of the house. And the police soon came to suspect Coleman himself because they found messages on his phone that made it clear he'd been having an affair. In the end, all of the evidence they had on him was circumstantial because he'd obviously covered his tracks very carefully, being a security advisor as he was. And actually, what did for him and what got him convicted was the testimony of a guy called Robert Leonard, who was an FBI forensic linguistics expert. And basically, by analysing the threatening messages he said he'd been receiving, analysing the graffiti, and analysing his own prose style and his own writing, and looking at word choice, syntax, spelling, all these kinds of different features of the language, they found marked similarities across all the different writing that they were analysing. And this was the clincher, and he was prosecuted and sentenced to life in jail. I think what these kinds of insights maybe show us is that all of our Englishes are different, okay? And it's strange because on one level, we're all primed or conditioned towards some kind of linguistic conformity by education. That's part of what education does, is to kind of impose a standard linguistic conformity on us. By the mass media, by socially sanctioned standards, and so on. All of these things impact upon us and kind of push us towards some kind of recognition of standard usage. But at the same time, we're also all the products of unique kind of input systems. And even if you grow up, next door to someone, you're going to be exposed to different kinds of Englishes as you're growing up, because you might be watching different kinds of TV shows, reading different kinds of things, listening to different people talk on YouTube or whatever, traveling to different places, hearing different kinds of accents to each other. And all of us, whether we're born in an English-speaking country or not, we're all the products of the unique input that we're exposed to. So in a sense, we're all the same, and yet we're all different. And I notice this quite a lot when I'm writing. Among other things, I'm a course book writer. I've co-authored the Outcome series with my co-writer, Andrew Walkley. And it's quite a weird thing because we're almost exactly the same age, me and Andrew, like 6 months apart. We're both in our mid-50s. We both went to state schools. We both went to university in the late 80s, early 90s. We both studied English literature. We both have spent most of our adult lives working as English language teachers. And yet, when we're writing, 9 times out of 10, our editors can tell which one of us wrote a particular text or a particular exercise, which is quite weird because when you're writing English language classroom material, you're kind of trying to extract yourself or remove, your own peculiar idiosyncrasies from what you're actually writing and write something more standardized. And yet, even when we're working at the lowest levels, like elementary kind of levels, where we're operating within a very linguistically restricted framework, editors know which thing was written by me and which thing was written by Andrew. You might be thinking by this stage, okay, fair enough. What does any of this have to do with English language teaching? Well, I think the answer is quite a lot, actually. And one of the things that it's got to do with English language teaching is the continued kind of dominance of a certain native speakerist view of what makes a teacher. Okay. You probably don't need me to tell you that native speakerism is sadly still alive and well and still skewing the employment market. And this is true even in European Union countries where advertising on the basis of nationality is technically illegal. Here's a recent gem that I saw on an EU teachers group. Okay, this was on the English Teachers in Warsaw group. There's a public kindergarten in Ursinov hiring an English teacher or native speaker to a group of children aged 5 to 6. Okay. As you can see from my comment at the bottom, this is a kind of perfect encapsulation of the madness of native speakerism. It's not just that these places are distinguishing between so-called native speaker teachers and non-native speaker teachers. They basically just prefer natives full stop. You know, truck driving natives, I don't know, road building natives, pub landlord natives, doesn't matter. You've got a British passport, you're better than a non-native English language teacher. You might be thinking, well, there must be a reason for this, okay? There must be something that native speakers possess that somehow distinguishes us from people who weren't born with English as their first language. There must be some way of immediately recognizing the output of a native speaker, something that sets native speaker English apart from those poor souls who were unlucky enough to have not been born with English as their mother tongue. Well, let's look at some evidence, shall we? Let's consider what makes native speakers special. Maybe, for instance, it's such shining examples of English as this. Sorry. What we found out is that none of these crimes could have been perpetrated without Vladimir Putin being in the know and not only aware of, but also approving of all these crimes. In a nutshell, what we found out is that Putin's operating an industrial scale assassination program on his own people. You might be thinking, well, there's proper native speaker English. Except the man who wrote this was a Bulgarian journalist called Christo Grosov, for whom English is actually his third language. So maybe not in this particular instance. Maybe this will help us work out what makes native speakers special. Okay, give you a minute just to read it. You can have a look at it and decide how special natives are from this. A bit more literary, a bit more creative, this one. And actually, not written by a native speaker, because this is an extract from a Joseph Conrad novel, a man who was born in what we would now recognize as being part of Ukraine. So maybe this is native speaker English. Again, I'll give you a minute just to read through. Except, actually, not. This was something an Austrian friend of mine wrote on Facebook the day that he heard David Crosby, the musician, had died. And this was his little tribute to David Crosby, written in English. Or maybe it's this. Bit more of a language oriented, English language teaching oriented example. Well, this one is actually by Sylvana Richardson, who's Argentinian by birth. And this is taken from her wonderful IATEFL plenary from 2016, I think it was, talking about the whole kind of madness around native speakerism. So, where does this leave us? Okay. If you can find quite easily, actually, remarkable examples of incredibly articulate, erudite, perfect kind of English written or spoken by people who didn't grow up with English as their first language, where does that leave native speakers? Well, maybe native speaker English resides in our accuracy, in our innate grasp of the correct way to use the Queen's, actually the King's, my bad, sorry, the King's English these days. Maybe the industry prefers native speakers because no native speaker would ever inflict any of these horrors on their students, right? Don't worry about it. You've done good. I wouldn't have said anything if I'd known. You was lucky there, to be honest. You're a total idiot. He wouldn't do nothing, even if you told him. Make sure you give the dog its food. It is. I should have went this morning, but I forgot. My mum loves cats. Cats what? We're not in possession of this information. Just cats. That'll learn you to keep your big mouth shut. Can I have a lend of your pen? You probably realised as I'm showing you these that I'm leading you into a bit of a trap because these are all things I've collected over the last few months that I've seen native speakers either say or write. Okay, so if you're a native and you have to recognise that plenty of natives make what might be regarded as mistakes, and plenty of what we might call non-natives produce this kind of perfect English, what's left to give us our status within the industry? I guess what you might do is to say, oh, what you've just shown us, they're not technically mistakes. Those are variations rather than errors. Well, even if you want to go down that road, okay, you're still left with this perverse situation where there are lots of teachers out there who kind of get very frustrated that their elementary and pre-intermediate students aren't producing fully grammatically accurate English, while people who are being offered jobs just because of their passports get a free pass and they're allowed to make these kinds of variations because of where they were born and because of the passports they hold. So just to kind of summarize some of the basic things I'm trying to sort of get at this particular juncture, okay? I think a lot of people that we might think of as non-natives use English already to an incredibly sophisticated degree. And this is only going to continue to become more and more true, I think, in the years to come. The level of English that a lot of people who speak English or use English as a second or third or fourth language are capable of is often far more incredible than people who grow up in English speaking countries are often capable of. I mean, I've worked with native speaker teachers myself who, when you put them on their first proficiency class, come out crying because they don't know as much vocabulary as the scary Swedish journalists in the class who are asking about the difference between ramification, implication, and consequence, those kind of classes. Oh, sorry. I think also it's just recognizing that being born in an English speaking country doesn't mean you'll speak any kind of standard English. Presumably, with the Polish kindergarten, what they're looking for when they're advertising for an English teacher or a native speaker is someone who will bring standard English to their 5 and 6 year olds. But there's no guarantee that that will happen just because of what your particular passport happens to be. Usually at this stage, when I'm talking to die-hard, I must be good because of my passport kind of people, the last two cards that get played are to do with culture and accents. People will tell you, oh no, you have to have a native speaker because native speakers know about the culture and listen to my accent. Well, neither of these things really exist as separate, clearly definable, discrete entities. When people talk about having cultural background knowledge, it's almost always a very vague and very undefined kind of term. When you ask people what exactly they know in terms of cultural background knowledge that makes them better language teachers, it's very hard to get answers to these kinds of questions. And, all of us live in slightly different cultural and subcultural universes in lots of different ways. The killer usually is asking people, so this native speaker cultural knowledge that you possess, are you able to teach it? Well, the answer obviously has to be yes, or else it's a worthless gift. If you can teach it, that means other people can learn it, presumably. And if other people can learn it, that presumably means other people have already learned some of these things. And some of the people who've already learned some of the cultural background knowledge things that you think you're able to teach may well not be people who've grown up speaking English as a first language, but who've still nevertheless managed to learn this transmissible, mysterious cultural background knowledge, and presumably are therefore also able to teach this stuff themselves. If you're also looking for kind of native speaker agreement on exactly what the cultural aspect of being a native speaker involves, all I can do, I think, in this situation is wish you good luck in your search for this mysterious beast out there, which really just leaves us with accents. And I think accent is, particularly problematic. You'll probably know already that there's basically no research out there that shows that students end up picking up their teachers' accents. The vast majority of students I've ever taught basically end courses I've done with them, even like courses over a year where I'm seeing them 3 times a week, 3 hours a day. They still don't end up sounding like me at the end of the course. There may be some of you out there who think that's probably a good thing, but I think generally students don't end up sounding like their native speaker teachers. The only time you really do get students who sound like their teachers is often in monolingual situations where the teacher's bilingual themselves and maybe has a slight, German or Arabic or Spanish or French or Japanese accent or whatever, that the students may aspire to and move slightly closer towards. I think there's also a more problematic issue here, which is when students say they want a British accent or they want an American accent. Well, I mean, firstly, I think it's an unrealistic thing to want. It's nice to want things, okay? As a football fan, I want Arsenal to win the Champions League. I've been waiting many, many years for this to happen. There's no immediate prospect of it occurring, but you can still want these things, Nothing wrong with wanting, so long as you're not expecting. It's fine for students to want particular accents, but just saying you want a British accent or an American accent, well, which one? Okay, because you don't need to travel far within either country to realize that there are thousands of different accents within both places. You drive the 30 miles from Manchester to Liverpool, it's like 45-minute drive, and the accent's completely different in the two cities. Which one of those is it people want when they want a British accent? You go to Texas and then you go to Brooklyn and then you go to California. The accents vary wildly. When people talk about wanting an American accent, which one is it they're after? Probably, I guess, we have to recognize that what people maybe mean when they say they want a British accent is they want to speak received pronunciation. And I don't know about you, but the only people I've ever met face to face in my life who speak with this peculiar forced received pronunciation are actually foreign teachers of English, like Argentinian teachers or Polish teachers or whatever, who've kind of trained themselves to speak this weird approximation of received pronunciation. In the UK itself, only about 3 to 4% of people speak what we would classify as received pronunciation. And it's generally now, I think, associated with a class of people who are often guilty of the worst kind of accent prejudices out there. People I have no idea why you'd wish to try to ape or why you'd wish to try to sound like, because even if you learn to sound like them, they're not going to accept you into their little circle because you didn't go to Eton. This brings me really to the crux of my whole argument, I guess, and it's this, that I think there is no one single thing out there which is English, okay? Basically, English is what we do when we use English to communicate. English really ultimately only exists in our interactions, in our conversations, in our social media posts, in our letters, in our books, in our teacher development talks, and so on. And every single one of you here watching this talk speaks a slightly different English. And all of our Englishes are always provisional and always developing, I think. You know, none of us has a fixed version of English. We're always learning and adapting and changing and modifying and adding to what we know. We're all in this process of changing and becoming as we kind of go through our lives. Yeah. So I'm just going to sort of summarize what I think are some, basic points that maybe relate to classrooms and maybe relate to the way we think about what we do as English language teachers and as teacher trainers and as people working as responsible professionals in the field of English language teaching. Give me a minute just to drink some tea. Give me a sec. Sorry, you can admire the teacup as big as my head as I'm drinking it. My apologies. Keeps me going. So I think the first thing we can do is just sort of recognize and embrace the fact that we all have different Englishes. This idea that there's some kind of mythical dividing line that separates the linguistic competence of so-called natives from so-called non-natives is basically nonsense, I think. We all share a huge amount of common ground. And we all need to speak in language that the people we're talking to understand. But all of us have our own peculiarities and our own quirks. And I think these are to be accepted and recognized and celebrated in many kinds of ways. I think unless there's a very specific reason for using terms like native speaker teacher or non-native speaker teacher, and by a specific reason, I mean, for example, maybe you're writing a blog post or you're writing a conference talk problematizing the ideas of the terms native speaker and non-native speaker teacher, or, you're doing a talk like this, unless there's a very specific reason for these particular phrases being used, I would just ask that people please stop using them. I think we should just reject this kind of stark dichotomy that they suggest. And instead, here's a radical idea. We could just talk about teachers, okay? Or maybe teachers of English, if we want to be a bit more specific. If you're one of those people that's very binary and you really feel this urge to divide teachers up into little groups, how about dividing teachers into different little groups? How about experienced teachers and less experienced teachers? Or here's one that native speaker teachers might start to freak out about a little bit. How about dividing teachers into bilingual teachers and monolingual or trilingual teachers? Because when you start to do that, obviously the boot's on the other foot. And native speakers who've never learned a foreign language suddenly realize they're actually at a bit of a disadvantage in that particular division of teachers. Or how about teachers of adults and teachers of under 18-year-olds? You know, there are plenty of other ways you can divide teachers up without dividing them on the basis of passport. I think it's also just recognizing that the whole idea of you know, saying someone's a native because of their passport is a kind of madness. I have a friend who's originally from the Czech Republic, from Czechia, from Prague, called Jirka Kaspar. And I trained him on his CELTA course like 15 years ago. And he was an incredible student. He did his proficiency here, he did his degree here, his master's degree, he did a PhD here. He ended up marrying a Czech woman who was of Vietnamese heritage here in London. She was working for the NHS. And they both wanted to go and work in Hong Kong because Jirka was a kind of kung fu and martial arts enthusiast, as well as being a great teacher. And he was applying for all of these jobs and getting kickbacked. And they basically kept saying, we only employ native speakers. And he phoned me up one day and said, I fear the time has come where I have to apply for British citizenship. And he'd been here about 12 years by this point. He went through the British citizenship test. He did his test. He had this big ceremony where he was made officially British. It was quite a sort of strange moment to witness. And then he started applying for jobs. And suddenly, as soon as he wrote British on his application form, he became a native speaker and he got offered jobs in Hong Kong, and off he went with his wife. And that's how ridiculous the whole thing is. You know, you undergo a kind of naturalization process and overnight you become a native speaker because the people you're applying for jobs with are scared of discriminating against you just because of your surname, because they know that you might be second, third, fourth, 10th generation Anglo-Czech or whatever. So, you know, let's just stop this way of dividing people up. I think there's also a responsibility on us to call out native speaker bias when we see it, especially if we are what the market would call natives. You saw my little comment earlier on that English Teachers in Warsaw post. You know, it's one of the ways I keep myself off the street. Is I sit there on these Facebook groups looking at these adverts saying, can you please just stop doing this? This is against European law and it's discriminatory and disrespectful to the many excellent non-native speaker teachers out there, which then usually provokes a whole load of hostility from entitled people who believe that their passports make them somehow superior. But I feel like I'm at least challenging it. And I think in many ways, you know, in the same way as racism can only really be tackled by white people learning more about the impact of racism on Black lives, or, you know, misogyny can only really be tackled by men listening a bit more to women talk about their experiences and adjusting their own behavior accordingly. Native speakerism will only really die out when more of us who are natives are aware of the way it blights the lives of our non-native colleagues. And it really does blight the lives of people, I think. I mean, I've worked with really great teachers who I've had to cover for. And when I've covered for them, I've realized that they've changed their name for the students. So, you know, maybe they're called Kasha, and you go in and say, hi, I'm covering for Kasha today. And the class go, who? And you go, your teacher, Kasha? Oh, Kate. And it's like, I see what's happened here. And what Kasha has done is decided not to call herself Kasha because she doesn't want the students to realize she's Polish. So she's anglicized her name. And that kind of self-erasure is not good for people. It's not good to feel that you have to pretend to be something you're not in order to do something you're already really expert at. And so I think if you see an advert for natives only, you can ask a question as to why it's deemed necessary. When you get students who say they want to speak like a native, you can just sit them down and point out it's quite a problematic concept. And please don't promote yourself simply on the basis of where you were born, because a passport is not a teaching qualification. I think another thing you can do is just recognize that whether you're a native or a non-native, so-called, there are many different routes to a particular destination. And the idea that there's only ever going to be one answer or one correct answer, or that one answer is more common than others, or one answer is the native speaker answer, is optimistic at best. I run a Facebook group called English Questions Answered, which you're all welcome to join. Okay, English Questions Answered. And basically, it's just a space where anyone can ask questions about problems they're having with language. Okay. And what you notice time and time and time again is that someone asks a question and you get countless different responses in response to the answer. So we recently had this one. What do you call it during a discussion when someone digresses from the main subject, maybe to avoid answering a tough question, trying to turn everyone's attention away from the main issue to something else? Well, you ask 50 teachers, regardless of where they're from, this question, you're going to get 60 different answers. Okay. Here are some of the answers that came up. Do you mean diverge? Veer? Depends what you want to say. You can deflect or divert. You can draw away attention or distract people. You get sidetracked. Evasion and diversion are common debating tactics. Maybe you mean dodge the question, change the subject, deflect attention away from something you don't want to talk about, and on and on and on it went. And there was no consensus among native speakers, even native speakers from the same country, about how best to answer this question. And I think just recognizing that this is the reality, that we don't all agree, and that there isn't one fixed way that we would all answer particular questions, is helpful for us and for students, actually. Yeah, you mean like when people pivot. Okay. The next point I'd like to make is just please stop with the accent obsession. Okay. For all of us, our accents, just like our Englishes, come in many different shapes and sizes. And for all of us, they are the product of the inputs that we've been exposed to. And this is why you can have two people in London who grow up next to each other in the same street, but who may end up with slightly different accents. One of them may have a Scottish mother or a Jamaican father, or they may spend time every summer with their relatives in Canada. The other one may exclusively watch Australian TV series or listen to UK grime music or whatever. And for all of us, we are very much the products of what's shaped us. We're the products of where we've been, who we've spoken to, what we've listened to, and so on. And for many of us, that will include all of the kind of years of L1 input that shapes your earliest experiences of how language sounds. And I just look at this and think, why would you want to try to eradicate that? I get that certain accents are held in higher esteem than others, obviously. You know, as someone who was the first kid in his family to go to university and who only really became aware of the fact that I had a specific accent when I did go to university, I'm obviously aware of the fact that, you know, there are certain accents which are more privileged than others. In English, you know, the French accent is seen as sexy in a way that the Birmingham accent or a Somali accent isn't. Received pronunciation is still seen as a signifier of class or education, in the way that a South London accent or an Essex accent isn't. But when you're faced with a system of irrational prejudice like this, you've basically got two choices. You can try and pander to it and force yourself to become something you're not in order to pass yourself off as this thing that you're not, which basically just perpetuates the system of prejudice. Or you can resist it and challenge it and try to subvert it. And you can help to reshape attitudes and change the conversation. If you never hear sexy, Brummies, or Somalis, or you never hear sharp, intelligent people with South London accents or Essex accents. How are people from those linguistic backgrounds ever going to gain the confidence that they can become those things themselves? You know, you need to see yourself represented in order to believe that there are doors that you can walk through like this. In the same way, I think I would just ask teachers not to fetishize accents yourself, both in your talk with students and in your general discourse. Just stop calling certain accents beautiful or ugly, okay? And recognize that the way in which accents are framed and perceived is often rooted in colonialism, in classism, in regionalism, in racism, and so on. One of the things that really winds me up intensely is when I see videos by the likes of English with Lucy claiming to help you deal with the 10 hardest British accents to understand. Because really, what she's talking about as a kind of posh, southern, upper middle class woman is accents that she's not very familiar with. Basically, what these videos should be called is something like 10 accents I haven't been exposed to as much as maybe I should, and that I'm still struggling with a bit myself. And what you get in these videos is posh, southern, upper middle class people telling you how difficult it is to understand someone from Glasgow or someone from Newcastle. Well, with a mum who lives in Durham, I can tell you that if you're from Durham, Jord is not actually that difficult. And with a brother who spent most of his adult life in Scotland, I can tell you that if you live in Gourock, Glaswegian ain't that difficult. Accent is a kind of two-way street, basically. The difficulty that you may have decoding a particular accent, it is rooted in lack of familiarity and where you're starting from. And what you might find hard to understand might be completely easy for someone else to understand. When I start talking about all these kinds of things, one common comment I often get goes something like this. Oh, right. So you're just saying anything goes, right? You're just saying it's a free for all, that there's no right and there's no wrong anymore. Is that what you're saying? Well, that's not what I'm saying at all. And I think it's fine to teach standard forms, okay? As a course book writer, generally what we're trying to do is to present some form of standard English, you know, British English, global English. But I think we should all be doing that with an awareness that what's standard in one place may not be standard in another. There is no one universal fixed truth that's always going to be true. Okay. And it's just good to realize that, and for students to also realize that. And, you know, when you're teaching things like the present perfect, and then you realize that over the pond in America, they often don't use the present perfect where Brits would use the present perfect. And what? You know, just deal with it, okay? And just recognize that there are these differences and accept them. I think connected to this is just being careful how you talk and maybe how you think about non-standard forms. These kind of things like, you know, can you give us the end of your pen? That'll learn you to keep your big mouth shut. Those kinds of things from earlier. Using non-standard forms isn't an indicator of intelligence or lack of intelligence. It isn't an indicator of an inability to express yourself in an articulate manner, any more than a received pronunciation accent and an easy way with sophisticated grammar and Latin quotes is an indicator of humanity or empathy or moral virtue. Non-standard forms are just non-standard forms, and users may choose to use them for any number of reasons. You may use them as a badge of identity, you may use them as a bit of regional pride, you may use them as a sign of solidarity when you're on the street or with family members or whatever. You may use them because they scan better in a poem or in a song lyric. And you may be someone like me who switches between non-standard and more standard forms depending who you're talking to, where you are, what your context is, and, which part of yourself you're expressing in that particular moment. I think we should also just stop thinking about American English being this and British English being that. One of the weirdest questions I get asked, and I do get asked it on a regular basis, is how I feel about American English. I understand that this is basically a kind of coded question, and that when people are asking me this, really what they want me to do is to back up their own prejudices by saying how terribly degraded American English is and how pure and virtuous British English is. But, these kind of notions are frankly ridiculous. The main thing I usually think when I'm asked this is, whose American English are we talking about? I mean, when I'm listening to Trump, he scares the hell out of me, basically. And I find his English, his language, his rhetoric quite frightening and quite repulsive. If I'm listening to someone like Professor Timothy Snyder, I've been watching all of his Yale lectures on the history of Ukraine. I listen to him and feel there may be a bit more hope for humanity. And I think all of us would just do well to listen to the person and what they're saying, okay? Rather than listen to the accent, rather than listen to the grammar, rather than listen and try and correct them. First and foremost, listen to the person, listen to the content of what they're saying, and judge them on that, not on the packaging that the language comes wrapped up in. Finally, I think, once you accept that for all of us, our Englishes are provisional and developing, I guess it means there's then a kind of responsibility on all of us to keep developing. And this is true wherever we were born, whatever passports we come with. And what it means, I think, is exposing ourselves to as much English as you can, broadening our understanding of similarities and differences, and learning, oh, okay, that's an Aussie expression. I've never heard that before. That's interesting. Now I know. Being alert to the novel, the odd, staying open, and always trying to learn more. And in this, I think, there's a kind of world of endless interest and endless entertainment for all of us as we continue along our journeys as English language teachers. I'm going to stop there. I think I've run 5 minutes over. If anyone wants a copy of the PowerPoint or whatever, feel free to email me. It's hugh@lexicallab.com. Please do check out our website, see what we offer there. And if you're on Instagram, please do follow us. We're lexical_lab.